All right, welcome. In this explainer, we are going to unpack the massive wave of European imperialism that, for better or worse, completely reshaped the world we live in today.
Let's just start with this cartoon from 1911. It's incredibly powerful. It shows the major European powers literally carving up a continent they saw as sleeping. And it really gets to the heart of the big question we're tackling here. How on earth did a handful of nations manage to take over so much of the globe and do it so quickly?
So to really get a handle on this global takeover, we first have to look at what was going on inside Europe itself. We need to understand the engines that were driving this incredible and often brutal expansion. So what was pushing all this? Well, the key thing to remember is that it wasn't just one thing. It was kind of a perfect storm. First, you've got the Industrial Revolution creating this insatiable hunger for raw materials, things like rubber, cocoa, you name it. Plus, they needed new places to sell all the stuff their factories were making. Then, you've got this intense nationalism boiling up, where having a big empire became a status symbol. It was proof that you were a great power. And on top of all that, there were real social problems at home. Unemployment, class conflict, and building an empire seemed like a convenient solution.
And just listen to this quote from Cecil Rhodes, one of the biggest empire builders of the time. He's not even hiding it. He's basically saying, look, we need an empire to act as a safety valve. We needed to ship our extra people and our social problems somewhere else to avoid a murderous civil war right here at home. It's a pretty shocking and honest admission, really.
But, economics and politics don't quite tell the full story. To make all of this feel justifiable, a new and really dangerous way of thinking started to take hold. It was an ideology that said Europeans were just, well, a superior race.
And this idea got a name, social Darwinism. It was a total twisting of Charles Darwin's scientific theories. It took survival of the fittest and applied it to human societies, basically arguing that it was natural, even progressive, for stronger European races to dominate and push aside weaker races around the world. It gave a kind of pseudo-scientific cover for racism and conquest.
Okay, so you've got the motivations, the economic, political, and ideological fuel. But how did it actually play out on the ground? Well, what happened next was a frantic, unprecedented land grab that we now call the Scramble.
This timeline really shows you the astonishing speed of it all. Just think about this. In only 25 years, basically from 1875 to 1900, nearly all of Africa was carved up and claimed. How was that even possible? Well, technology was a huge part of it. The Suez Canal and new steamships made travel way faster. The telegraph meant you could send orders in an instant. And crucially, new weapons like the machine gun gave Europeans a massive and devastating military advantage.
And look, this scramble wasn't just confined to Africa. The same thing was happening all across Asia. As you can see from this map, from India under the British to the Dutch East Indies, what's now Indonesia, huge ancient societies were falling under foreign control. Their entire economies were being re-engineered to serve interests thousands of miles away.
And this map, this is the result of that scramble for Africa. European leaders got together at conferences, like the one in Berlin, and literally drew lines on a map. They created these brand new colonies with almost zero regard for the people who actually lived there, for their ethnic groups, their languages, their existing kingdoms. And the consequences of those artificial borders are things that many of these countries are still dealing with today.
So we've covered the why and the how, but let's shift gears and talk about the human impact. What did it actually mean to suddenly find your homeland ruled by a foreign power? For millions of people, it meant their entire world was turned upside down. At its core, the colonial project was about making money, and that meant extracting wealth. And in its most extreme cases, that system was built on a foundation of just brutal forced labor. I mean, this testimony from the Congo Free State it's horrifying to read. This was the personal property of Belgium's King Leopold II, and he unleashed a reign of terror to force people to collect rubber. As this survivor describes, if you didn't meet your quota, the punishment was mutilation or death. This wasn't just work, it was slavery enforced by pure terror.
So colonial economies totally remade how people worked. You had the extreme cases of forced labor, like we just saw in the Congo, to get rubber for tires back in Europe. Then you had cash crop agriculture, where farmers were either encouraged or flat out forced to grow things like cotton or cocoa for export instead of growing food for their own families. And finally, you had millions of people who became wage laborers, often migrating long distances to work in terrible conditions in European-owned mines or on plantations.
This side-by-side comparison is so telling, isn't it? On the left, you've got the public face of empire, this grand, over-the-top ceremony designed to show off power and splendor. But then on the right, you have the quiet, everyday reality, a clear and absolute racial hierarchy, where the power dynamic is unmistakable, even in a private home.
So finally, let's zoom out and think about the legacy. The colonial era wasn't just some phase in history that ended. It left behind these deep, complicated, and often contradictory marks that are still shaping our world in very real ways.
And this right here is one of the biggest legacies, this massive contradiction. I mean, think about it. The very same European countries that were promoting ideas like democracy, national independence, and human equality back home were doing the exact opposite in their colonies. They ran them as dictatorships, they obviously denied them independence, and they set up these rigid systems of racial ranking. And that hypocrisy, well, that would eventually become a powerful weapon for the independence movements that fought to end colonial rule.
And that brings us right up to the present day. When you see arguments about tearing down statues of old colonial figures, or debates about reparations for slavery, what you're seeing is our society still wrestling with this history. It forces us to confront some really tough questions about the past and how it still echoes today. And it leaves us with one final, and I think really important question. Who gets to make history, and whose version of the story gets to be told?